Imagine, for a moment, that you are the captain of a grand, sophisticated vessel. You stand at the helm, convinced that every turn of the wheel, every adjustment of the sail, is a product of your direct command. You feel the wind on your face and believe you are the one navigating the vast expanse of the ocean. But suddenly, without warning, the wheel spins violently out of your grip. The ship veers into a storm you didn't see coming. Driven by currents that exist miles below the surface, far beyond your sight or reach, you are no longer the captain. You are a hostage to the sea. This is the fundamental tragedy of the modern man. We pride ourselves on our rationality, our curated identities, and our ironclad logic. Yet, we are all haunted by moments of possession. We scream at those we love, we sabotage our greatest opportunities, or we fall into pits of despair that seem to have no bottom. Carl Jung famously remarked that man likes to believe he is master of his soul, but to Jung, this was a dangerous illusion, a mirage that keeps us from seeing the true architecture of our suffering. The truth is far more unsettling. Your mind is not a single room, it is a sprawling ancient fortress with corridors you have never walked and vaults that have remained locked since your childhood. What you call I, your ego, is merely a small candle burning in a massive, darkened hall. And when your emotions spiral out of control, it is because something from the darkness has stepped into the light of that candle. Jung called these forces autonomous complexes. Think of them as sub-personalities, fragments of the psyche that have split off and developed a life of their own. They are the gears of an invisible engram, grinding away beneath your conscious awareness. They are the uninvited guests at the table of your life. When a complex is triggered, it doesn't just influence you, it replaces you, for a few minutes, or perhaps a few hours. You are not you. You are the embodiment of an ancient wound, a collective fear, or a repressed desire. To understand why your emotions are uncontrollable, we must first accept a terrifying premise. You are not alone in your own head. There is a rostro, trace of a deeper, more primitive self that does not obey your laws. It is the shadow, the repository of everything you have deemed unacceptable about yourself. It is the repository of your power, your rage, and your unlived life. We often treat our emotions as glitches in the system, but they are actually the language of this hidden architecture. They are signals from the abyss, trying to tell us that the bridge between our conscious and unconscious worlds has collapsed. We spend our lives trying to build walls against the tide, only to find that the water is rising from the floorboards. Before we go deeper into the specific mechanics of how these complexes are formed and how they hijack your biology, I invite you to pause. If you find yourself drawn to these questions, if you feel that there is more to your internal world than what the surface reveals, then you are already a seeker. Join our community of explorers. By subscribing, you are not merely following a channel. You are committing to the work of looking inward, joining a circle of those who refuse to live as strangers to themselves. Let us continue the descent together. The question we must now confront is not how to stop these emotions, but how to understand the why behind their autonomy. Why does the psyche create such violent eruptions? Why is the shadow so determined to be heard? The answer lies in the very mechanism of the gears we have tried so hard to ignore. The descent continues, and the rostro leads us to the basement of the soul, where the real architects of your destiny are currently at work. To understand why our emotions possess such a violent autonomous quality, we must look at the blueprint of our own development. From the moment we are born, we are taught to curate the architecture of our souls. We learn which traits earn us a smile from our parents and which ones invite the cold silence of rejection. This is the birth of the persona, the mask we wear to navigate the social theater. But every mask casts a shadow. For every quality we pull into the light of our conscious identity, its opposite is cast into the darkness of the unconscious. If you pride yourself on being kind, your capacity for cruelty is not destroyed, it is simply exiled. If you believe yourself to be rational, your irrationality begins to brew in the basement of your mind. This is the origin of the shadow. It is not a collection of evil traits, but rather a reservoir of unlived life. It is the gold we found too heavy to carry, the fire we were told was too dangerous to light. Jung understood that the psyche is a closed energy system. This energy, this libido, cannot be deleted, it can only be transformed or repressed. When we repress an emotion, we think we are silencing it, but we are actually feeding it. We are handing over the keys of our internal kingdom to a force that now operates without our consent. The mechanism of this possession is what Jung called projection. This is the grand mirage of human relationships. Have you ever met someone who triggered an immediate, visceral reaction in you? A rage that felt disproportionate, or a fascination that felt like a spell? In those moments, the out-of-control feeling occurs because you are looking into a mirror you do not recognize. The quality you hate in the other person is a trace of your own shadow, a fragment of yourself that you have denied so long it has become a stranger. The emotion is not coming at you from the outside. It is erupting from you because the external world provided a hook for your internal ghost to hang its hat on. This is where the engranage, the gears of the unconscious, becomes truly dangerous. When we refuse to acknowledge our shadow, it begins to orchestrate our lives through what we mistakenly call fate. We find ourselves in the same toxic relationships, the same self-destructive patterns, the same paralyzing anxieties. We feel out of control because the other within us is making choices that the ego is too afraid to make. The anxiety of the modern age is, in many ways, the friction between the mask we have built and the reality of the shadow that is screaming to be integrated. Think of your psyche as an ancient code written over millennia. Within this code are the archetypes, universal patterns of human experience. When you feel a wave of out-of-control grief or a sudden, archetypal rage, you are not just experiencing your own personal history. You are tapping into a collective well. You are stepping into the role of the orphan, the warrior, or the betrayed. The reason these emotions feel so much larger than you is because they are larger than you. They are the currents of the collective unconscious, moving through the narrow pipes of your personal identity. When the pressure becomes too great, the pipes burst. This is the hidden alchemy of our suffering. We spend our lives trying to fix the problem of our emotions, treating them like a mechanical failure in a car. But the psyche is not a machine. It is a living, breathing ecosystem. Our strongest emotions are not errors. They are signals. They are the rostro that leads back to the parts of ourselves we have abandoned. We feel out of control because we have disconnected the steering wheel from the engine. And the engine is now taking us exactly where we need to go, even if it is into the heart of the storm. We live in a culture of management. We try to manage our stress, manage our anger, manage our time. But the shadow cannot be managed. It can only be faced. To look at your most unacceptable emotions and ask, what part of me is speaking right now, is the beginning of the end of the possession. It is the moment you stop running from the monster and realize the monster is simply a lonely, neglected version of yourself holding a lantern. As we move toward the final stage of our descent, we must ask, how do we stop being a victim of our own internal architecture? How do we move from the chaos of possession to the clarity of integration? The path forward is not found in more control, but in a radical form of psychological honesty and alchemy that turns the lead of our repressed pain into the gold of a unified self. We now stand at the deepest point of the descent, where the air is thin and the shadows are longest. Having understood that we are not the masters of our own house, and having identified the invisible gears that drive our emotional hijackings, we reach the stage of alchemical transformation. In the ancient art of the soul, this is where the negredo, the blackening, and the chaos begins its slow, painful shift toward the rubedo, the reddening of a life fully realized. To regain a sense of sovereignty, you must stop trying to defeat the emotion and start trying to host it. The practical alchemy of Carl Jung does not offer a sedative for your pain. It offers a crucible. When you feel that familiar, overwhelming surge, that heat in the chest or that cold void in the stomach, your instinct is to either explode or suppress. Both are forms of surrender. Instead, you must practice what Jung called carrying the tension of opposites. You must stand in the middle of the storm, feeling the full weight of the autonomous complex without letting it seize the controls. This is the architecture of the witness. You observe the rage, the jealousy, or the despair as if it were a weather pattern passing through a landscape. You acknowledge its presence, not as a flaw in your character, but as a messenger from the abyss. Transformation begins with a question asked in the dark. When the emotion is at its peak, you must engage in a silent, internal dialogue. You ask this force, what have you come to tell me? What part of my unlived life do you represent? This is not a metaphor, it is a technical necessity. By treating the emotion as a separate entity, a guest in your house, you break the spell of identity. You are no longer angry, you are a vessel witnessing the presence of anger. This subtle shift in the code of your consciousness is the first step in dismantling the engram of possession. But the work does not end with observation. The real alchemy lies in the rostro, the trace of gold hidden in the shadow. Jung believed that the very things we find most uncontrollable are often the keys to our greatest strengths. Within that, out-of-control rage may be the buried seed of necessary boundary setting. Within that, paralyzing sadness may be a profound call for a more authentic path. To integrate the shadow is to reclaim the energy you have spent a lifetime repressing. It is to take the fire that was burning the house down and move it into the hearth to provide warmth and light. This process requires a radical honesty that few are willing to endure. It means admitting that the villain in your story is often a projection of your own discarded potential. It means realizing that the out-of-control nature of your feelings is actually a compensatory movement of the psyche, trying to balance a life that has become too narrow, too artificial, or too detached from the soul. The goal of this journey is not a state of perpetual combat, it is a mirage. The goal is wholeness. A whole person is not someone who has eliminated their demons, but someone who has integrated them into the grand architecture of their being. As we emerge from this psychological descent, the world may look the same, but the mirror has changed. You are no longer a victim of a chaotic interior world, but a conscious participant in its unfolding. The possession ends the moment you stop running and turn to face the abyss. You realize that the uncontrollable emotions were never meant to destroy you. They were the only language the unconscious had left to wake you from your slumber. The ship is still on the ocean. The storms will still come. The currents will still pull from below. But you are no longer a hostage at the helm. You have met the sea. You have learned the names of the winds. And you have understood, perhaps for the first time, that the house you live in is vast, mysterious, and ultimately, your own. The silence that follows this realization is not the silence of the void, but the silence of the master who has finally come home.